When the last Crusader fortresses fell in the Levant at the close of the 13th century, the medieval world believed it had witnessed the end of an era. The cross-marked warriors who had marched eastward with songs of Jerusalem on their lips had been driven back their kingdoms, dissolved their dreams of a permanent Christian presence in the Holy Land, shattered against the walls of Acre in 1291. Yet what ended in defeat and blood would prove to be only the beginning of transformations that would reshape 3 continents and redefine the very nature of human civilization. The Crusades, those 2 centuries of intermittent holy war, pilgrimage and colonial enterprise, did not simply conclude. They metastasized, their consequences spreading through the bloodstream of medieval society like a fever that breaks not into health, but into a new and unfamiliar condition. The world that rose from the ruins of Outremer bore little resemblance to the confident unified Christendom that had launched the First Crusade in 1095. In its place emerged a fractured landscape of competing powers, new intellectual currents, transformed economies, and a profound crisis of faith that would ultimately give birth to modernity itself. This is not a story of the Crusades themselves. That tale has been told countless times, with varying degrees of romance, horror, and scholarly precision. This is instead the story of what came after, the long, complex, often contradictory process by which medieval society absorbed, rejected, and was transformed by the crusading experience. It is a story that spans from the ports of Venice to the courts of Cairo, from the universities of Paris to the steppes of Central Asia, from the counting houses of Florence to the monasteries of Mount Athos. The transformations were neither simple nor unidirectional. The world after the Crusades was not merely better or worse than what came before. It was fundamentally different, shaped by forces that the Crusaders themselves could never have imagined they were unleashing. When Pope Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem in 1095, he could not have foreseen that his appeal would eventually contribute to the fragmentation of the very papal authority he represented. When knights took up the cross believing they served God's will, they could not have known they were participating in a process that would eventually lead to the questioning of religious authority itself. The immediate aftermath of the Crusades was marked by a profound sense of failure and divine abandonment. For 200 years, the Christian West had poured its wealth, its noble blood, and its spiritual fervor into the project of holding the Holy Land. Kings had bankrupted their treasuries, knights had died by the thousands, and common people had suffered under crushing taxation to fund expeditions that ultimately achieved nothing permanent. When Acre fell in 1291, it was not merely a military defeat. It was a theological catastrophe that demanded explanation. The question that haunted Christendom was simple, yet devastating. Why had God allowed his warriors to fail? The Crusades had been preached as God's own work, blessed by popes, promised with indulgences that guaranteed salvation. Yet they had ended in comprehensive defeat. This cognitive dissonance produced a crisis of faith that would reverberate through the 14th and 15th centuries, contributing to the growing skepticism about church authority that would eventually explode in the Protestant Reformation. Some sought to explain the failure through the lens of sin and unworthiness. Preachers thundered that Christendom had lost the Holy Land because of its own corruption and vice. This explanation, while theologically convenient, had the unintended consequence of directing critical attention toward the Church itself. If Christian society was too sinful to deserve victory, who bore primary responsibility? Increasingly, fingers pointed at the clergy, whose wealth and worldliness seemed particularly egregious in light of Christ's poverty. The Franciscan movement, which had emerged during the crusading era, emphasizing apostolic poverty, gained new resonance in this context. Others looked for scapegoats. Jews faced renewed persecution, accused of undermining Christian society from within. Heretics were hunted with increased vigor, as if purifying Christendom of doctrinal deviation might restore divine favor. The Inquisition, which had been formalized during the crusading period, intensified its activities in the decades following the fall of Acre. Yet these violent efforts to restore religious unity only highlighted the fractures they were meant to heal. A third response was more subtle, but ultimately more consequential. A growing number of intellectuals began to question whether the Crusades had ever been justified in the first place. Drawing on the recovery of Aristotelian philosophy and newly available Arabic commentaries, scholars in universities began to apply reason to questions of just war, legitimate authority, and the relationship between faith and violence. These inquiries, while couched in careful language to avoid charges of heresy, planted seeds of doubt about the entire crusading project. The political landscape of Europe was fundamentally altered by the crusading experience. The concentration of power that characterized the High Middle Ages began to dissolve as the costs of crusading revealed the limitations of royal authority. Kings had mortgaged their domains, sold privileges to cities and nobles, and alienated crown lands to finance expeditions. When these expeditions failed to produce territorial gains or plunder, monarchs returned home to weakened positions. In France, the Crusades of Louis IX in the mid-13th century had been financed through extensive taxation that required royal negotiation with various estates and corporate bodies. This necessitated the development of representative institutions, the embryonic Estates General, that would eventually limit royal absolutism. The need to secure funding for holy war thus inadvertently created mechanisms of consultation and consent that constrained monarchical power. England's experience was similar. Richard I's participation in the Third Crusade had cost his kingdom dearly, and the ransom demanded for his release from captivity added further burden. His brother John inherited a treasury depleted by crusading expenses and a nobility accustomed to extracting concessions in exchange for financial support. The Magna Carta of 1215, while not directly caused by the Crusades, emerged from a political context shaped by decades of royal financial overreach linked to crusading taxation. The Holy Roman Empire, already a complex patchwork of territories with limited central authority, saw its fragmentation accelerated by crusading entanglements. Frederick II's conflicts with the papacy over his crusading obligations consumed decades of the 13th century and prevented any consolidation of imperial power in Germany or Italy. The interregnum that followed Frederick's death in 1250 left the empire permanently weakened, unable to match the emerging centralized monarchies of France and England. Paradoxically, while the Crusades weakened kings, they strengthened certain corporate bodies and urban centers. Cities that supplied ships, provisions, and credit for crusading expeditions gained privileges and autonomy. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa parlayed their logistical roles in the Crusades into dominant positions in Mediterranean trade. The Fourth Crusade's conquest of Constantinople in 1204, whatever its moral failings, delivered enormous economic benefits to Venice, establishing it as the premier maritime power in the eastern Mediterranean for the next 2 centuries. The Italian city-states emerged from the crusading era as the economic powerhouses of Europe. Their wealth was built on a foundation of crusading logistics, trade with Muslim ports despite papal prohibitions, and the financial instruments developed to transfer funds across long distances for crusading purposes. The bills of exchange, letters of credit, and banking techniques that would characterize Renaissance finance were refined in the crucible of crusading economics. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, represented an entirely new phenomenon in medieval society: permanent, international, military religious corporations. After the fall of Acre, these orders faced an identity crisis. The Templars, whose sole purpose had been the defense of the Holy Land, became obsolete overnight. Their vast wealth and lack of clear mission made them vulnerable, and Philip IV of France seized the opportunity to destroy them in 1307, confiscating their properties and eliminating a powerful independent corporation that had operated beyond royal control. The Hospitallers adapted by transforming themselves into a naval power based in Rhodes, continuing to wage war against Muslim shipping while maintaining their charitable missions. The Teutonic Knights redirected their energies to the conquest and colonization of the Baltic region, creating a territorial state in Prussia that would have profound consequences for European history. These adaptations demonstrated that the crusading impulse had not died with the fall of Acre. It had merely been redirected. The concept of permanent holy war institutionalized in these orders, left a troubling legacy. The idea that religious difference justified perpetual violence became embedded in European consciousness. The Reconquista in Iberia continued long after the fall of Acre, finally concluding with the conquest of Granada in 1492. The same year, Spain expelled its Jewish population and Christopher Columbus sailed westward, carrying the crusading mentality into a new hemisphere. The conquistadors, who would devastate the Americas, explicitly framed their enterprise in crusading terms, seeking to convert infidels and acquire wealth in God's name. The economic transformations triggered by the Crusades were perhaps more revolutionary than the political ones. The massive transfer of wealth from Europe to the Levant over 2 centuries had stimulated commercial development, monetized rural economies, and created demand for financial services. The Church's prohibition on usury had to be reconciled with the practical need for credit, leading to increasingly sophisticated justifications for interest-bearing loans disguised as partnerships or exchange transactions. Jewish moneylenders had traditionally filled this role, but Christian merchants and bankers increasingly entered the field during and after the Crusades. The Lombard bankers who operated throughout Europe developed techniques that circumvented usury prohibitions while providing essential services. The profits from these operations, combined with trade benefits from crusading connections, created a new class of wealthy merchants whose economic power challenged the traditional dominance of landed nobility. The transformation of agricultural production in response to crusading demands also had lasting effects. The need to supply grain, wine, horses, and manufactured goods for expeditions stimulated commercialization of the countryside. Peasants increasingly produced for markets rather than mere subsistence, paying rents in cash rather than labor services. This monetization of rural society would eventually contribute to the breakdown of the manorial system and the emergence of more fluid social structures. The Black Death, which struck Europe beginning in 1347, accelerated these economic and social transformations in ways that cannot be separated from the crusading legacy. The plague itself likely reached Europe through trade routes established during the crusading era, when Mediterranean commerce intensified dramatically. The catastrophic population loss, perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population, fundamentally altered labor relations. Peasants, now scarce and valuable, demanded better conditions and higher wages. The old feudal order, already strained by the economic changes of the crusading period, began to collapse. Lords who had mortgaged their estates to go crusading found themselves unable to extract sufficient revenues from their diminished populations. Cash-strapped nobles sold their lands or leased them on favorable terms to peasants. Urban centers offered freedom and opportunity to rural workers willing to escape manorial obligations. The rigid social hierarchy of the High Middle Ages gave way to more fluid structures that rewarded commercial acumen and entrepreneurship over inherited status. The intellectual transformations that followed the Crusades were equally profound. Contact with the Islamic world, despite the violence that characterized it, exposed European scholars to a vast corpus of knowledge that had been lost or never known. Arabic translations of Greek philosophical and scientific works, along with original contributions by Muslim scholars, began to flow into Europe through multiple channels. Toledo, conquered from Muslims in 1085, became a crucial center of translation in the 12th century. Scholars working there translated works by Aristotle, Ptolemy, Euclid, and others from Arabic into Latin, along with the commentaries of Islamic philosophers like Averroes and Avicenna. This recovered knowledge revolutionized European intellectual life, providing the foundation for scholastic philosophy and the university curriculum that would dominate education for centuries. The crusading presence in the Levant, however brief and violent, facilitated this transfer of knowledge. Crusaders and merchants brought back not only spices and silk, but also manuscripts, ideas, and curiosity about the sophisticated civilization they had encountered. Even as they fought against Muslims, Europeans could not help but notice that Islamic society possessed advanced mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy that surpassed their own. This created a profound tension in European consciousness. How could the enemies of Christ possess such knowledge and sophistication? Some resolved this paradox by attributing Islamic achievements to the Greek legacy that Muslims had preserved, implying that such knowledge properly belonged to Christian civilization. Others, more honest, recognized that Muslim scholars had made original contributions that Christians needed to learn from. This acknowledgement required a degree of intellectual humility that sat uncomfortably with the triumphalist rhetoric of crusading ideology. The translation movement initiated in the 12th century continued and expanded after the Crusades ended. By the 14th century, European scholars had access to nearly the entire corpus of Aristotelian philosophy, along with mathematical and scientific works that transformed their understanding of the natural world. The application of Aristotelian logic to theological questions, pioneered by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, created a systematic rational theology that attempted to reconcile faith and reason. Yet this very rationalism contained seeds of future religious upheaval. Once reason was accepted as a legitimate tool for understanding divine truth, it became difficult to limit its application. Scholars began to question received doctrines, to examine scripture critically, and to notice contradictions in church teachings. The nominalist philosophy of William of Ockham and others in the 14th century emphasized the limits of human reason in theological matters, but in doing so, it undermined the claims of institutional church authority to definitively interpret divine will. The invention of printing in the mid-15th century would amplify these intellectual transformations exponentially. The technology itself owed debts to knowledge transferred from the Islamic world, papermaking and certain mechanical principles. When Gutenberg's press began producing books in quantity, it democratized access to knowledge in ways that made the intellectual achievements of the post-crusading era available to an ever-widening audience. The Reformation, when it came, would be unthinkable without both the critical intellectual traditions developed in universities after the Crusades and the technological means to spread dissenting ideas rapidly. The cultural exchanges resulting from crusading contact with the Islamic world extended beyond philosophy and science. European material culture was transformed by goods and practices encountered in the Levant. Sugar, which had been a rare luxury, became more common as returning crusaders established its cultivation in Cyprus and Sicily. New textile techniques, decorative patterns, and architectural styles flowed westward. The pointed arch, often considered quintessentially Gothic, derived from Islamic architecture encountered by crusaders. Culinary practices changed as spices became more available and desirable. The very desire for spices that would drive European exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries was whetted during the crusading period, when nobles developed a taste for pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and other exotic flavorings. The search for direct routes to the spice sources, bypassing Muslim middlemen, would eventually lead to the circumnavigation of Africa and the discovery of the Americas, events that would reshape global history. Musical influences also flowed from east to west. The lute, which would become central to European music, derived from the Arabic oud. Certain poetic forms and themes in the troubadour tradition show Islamic influences, mediated through the complex cultural mixing that occurred in Sicily, Spain, and the Crusader states. The very concept of courtly love, which transformed European literature and social relations, may owe something to Arabic poetic traditions, though scholars debate the extent of this influence. Medicine was another field where Islamic knowledge proved superior to European practice. The works of Avicenna, Rhazes, and other Muslim physicians became standard texts in European medical education. Hospitals, as institutions for treating the sick, rather than merely housing the poor, were modeled on Islamic examples encountered by crusaders. The hospitallers themselves, despite their military functions, maintained medical facilities that incorporated Islamic practices. This transfer of medical knowledge had practical consequences that extended far beyond scholarly circles. Surgical techniques, pharmacology, and diagnostic procedures all benefited from Islamic medical texts. European physicians who studied these works became more effective practitioners, though medical care remained limited by the theoretical frameworks of the era. The Black Death would reveal the limitations of both Islamic and European medicine, but the exchange of knowledge had at least expanded the tools available to physicians attempting to understand disease. The experience of the Crusades also transformed European self-consciousness in fundamental ways. Before the crusading movement, Europe was not a meaningful political or cultural category. Christendom was the relevant identity, a religious community that transcended emerging national boundaries. The Crusades, by directing European attention outward against a common enemy, helped to create a sense of European identity, distinct from and opposed to the Islamic world. This identity formation had dark consequences. The definition of Christendom against an Islamic other encouraged intolerance not only of Muslims, but of anyone who did not fit the emerging definition of proper Christian identity. Jews, who had lived in European communities for centuries, faced increasing persecution. The crusading movement had unleashed pogroms from its very beginning. When the People's Crusade massacred Jewish communities in the Rhineland in 1096, this pattern of violence against Jews intensified in the centuries following the Crusades, culminating in expulsions from England, France, and Spain. Heretics also faced harsher treatment as religious boundaries hardened. The Albigensian Crusade in southern France in the early 13th century, technically a crusade despite being directed against fellow Christians, demonstrated that the machinery of holy war could be turned inward. The precedent of using military force to enforce religious conformity within Christendom would be repeatedly invoked in subsequent centuries, reaching a horrific climax in the wars of religion that would ravage Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Yet the crystallization of European identity also had productive aspects. The sense of sharing a common civilization, however imperfectly realized, encouraged cultural exchange among European regions. Scholars moved more freely between universities in Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and Cologne. Artistic styles, architectural innovations, and literary forms circulated more rapidly. The Gothic cathedrals that rose in the 13th and 14th centuries, financed partly by wealth generated through crusading-era economic expansion, represented a pan-European aesthetic that transcended local traditions. The failure of the Crusades also prompted a period of introspection and self-criticism in European thought. Writers began to question whether military violence was the appropriate response to religious difference. Ramon Llull, a 13th-century scholar who had actually lived among Muslims in Majorca, advocated for missionary activity based on reasoned persuasion rather than force. His ideas were not widely adopted in his own time, but they represented an alternative to the crusading mentality that would gradually gain adherents. The concept of the noble Saracen began to appear in European literature, suggesting a growing recognition that Muslims were not simply demonic enemies, but human beings capable of virtue and wisdom. Stories like those in Boccaccio's Decameron presented Muslim characters in complex, sometimes sympathetic ways that would have been unthinkable during the height of crusading fervor. This literary development reflected a slow maturation of European attitudes, though it coexisted with continued hostility and stereotyping. Dante's Divine Comedy, written in the early 14th century, offers a fascinating window into the contradictory attitudes of the post-crusading era. Dante places Muhammad in hell, condemned for schism and false prophecy, reflecting Orthodox Christian hostility. Yet he also places Saladin and Averroes in limbo, the relatively pleasant realm reserved for virtuous pagans who lived before Christ, acknowledging their nobility and wisdom. This nuanced treatment suggests that even a devout Christian poet could recognize virtue in Islam's greatest leaders while maintaining theological objections to the faith itself. The political relationship between Christian Europe and the Islamic world also evolved in the post-crusading era. The complete failure of military conquest led some rulers to pursue diplomatic and commercial relationships with Muslim powers. Venice and Genoa had always maintained trade relations with Muslim ports, often in violation of papal prohibitions on trading with the enemy. After the Crusades ended, these commercial relationships intensified, creating economic interdependencies that made new crusades increasingly impractical. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the 14th century created a new dynamic. Unlike the fragmented Muslim powers the Crusaders had faced in Syria and Palestine, The Ottomans represented a unified, expansionist state that threatened Christian territories. Their conquest of the Balkans and eventual capture of Constantinople in 1453 revived crusading rhetoric, but the military responses were largely ineffectual. European powers were too divided, too focused on their own conflicts, and too skeptical of papal authority to mount effective coordinated resistance. The fall of Constantinople, despite its symbolic importance as the ancient capital of Christian empire, did not produce the unified European response that earlier losses of Crusader territories had generated. This reflected the changed political landscape of Europe. The papacy, weakened by its own conflicts and the Great Schism that divided it from 1378 to 1417, could no longer command the moral authority to launch major expeditions. National monarchies were more concerned with their own power struggles than with distant holy wars. The failure to save Constantinople demonstrated conclusively that the age of crusading was over. Yet the Ottoman advance did have important consequences for European development. Byzantine scholars fleeing Turkish conquest brought Greek manuscripts and knowledge to Italy, contributing significantly to the Renaissance. The fall of Constantinople also disrupted established trade routes, increasing European interest in finding alternative paths to Asian markets, a quest that would lead to the Great Age of Exploration. In this indirect way, the Ottoman conquests that ended the Byzantine Empire contributed to the emergence of European global dominance. The Church itself underwent profound transformation in the centuries following the Crusades. The papacy had staked enormous spiritual and political capital on the crusading project. Popes had claimed authority to direct secular rulers, to tax clergy for crusading purposes, and to grant spiritual rewards, indulgences, in exchange for participation in holy war. When the Crusades failed, all of these claims looked hollow. The Avignon papacy, during which the popes resided in France rather than Rome from 1309 to 1377, was partly a consequence of conflicts generated by crusading politics. Philip IV of France's destruction of the Templars and his conflicts with Pope Boniface VIII over taxation for crusades led to a papacy effectively controlled by French interests. This Babylonian captivity damaged papal prestige throughout Europe, as other nations suspected the popes of serving French political interests. The Great Schism that followed, with competing popes in Rome and Avignon, further eroded papal authority. The conciliar movement, which sought to reform the Church through general councils superior to papal authority, gained strength from the scandals and divisions of this era. Though the councils ultimately failed to permanently limit papal power, they established precedents for questioning and limiting church authority that would be exploited by Protestant reformers in the 16th century. The system of indulgences, which had been developed and expanded during the crusading era, became increasingly corrupt and commercialized. Originally conceived as a spiritual benefit for those who fought and died in God's service, indulgences evolved into a financial instrument sold to raise revenue for church projects. The practice of selling spiritual grace for money contradicted fundamental Christian teachings and generated widespread resentment. When Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, criticizing the sale of indulgences, he was attacking a system that had its roots in crusading-era practices. The devotional life of ordinary Christians also changed in the post-crusading centuries. The catastrophic failure of the Crusades, combined with the trauma of the Black Death, produced a darker, more introspective piety. The cheerful confidence of the High Middle Ages, when people believed God was clearly on their side and would grant victory to his warriors, gave way to obsessions with death, judgment, and hell. The dance of death motif in art, showing death leading people of all ranks to the grave, reflected this morbid preoccupation. Mysticism flourished as an alternative to the corrupt institutional church. Mystics like Meister Eckhart, Julian of Norwich, and Catherine of Siena sought direct personal experience of the divine that bypassed clerical mediation. This emphasis on individual spiritual experience, while not directly challenging church authority, implied that ecclesiastical structures were not necessary for salvation. The implication would be drawn explicitly by later Protestant reformers. The Devotio Moderna movement, which emerged in the Netherlands in the late 14th century, emphasized personal piety, simple living, and the imitation of Christ rather than participation in the elaborate ceremonial religion of the institutional church. The Brethren of the Common Life, associated with this movement, established schools that educated a generation of reformers, including Erasmus. Their approach represented a quiet rejection of the militaristic, politically entangled, wealth-seeking church that had emerged from the crusading era. Popular religion also took forms that worried church authorities. Flagellant movements, beguines and beghards living in quasi-religious communities outside monastic control, and various prophetic and apocalyptic movements suggested that ordinary people were seeking spiritual meaning outside official channels. The church responded with persecution, but the impulse to find authentic religious experience beyond corrupt institutions could not be suppressed. The technological innovations of the post-crusading era, while not directly caused by the Crusades, flourished in the economic and intellectual environment shaped by them. The compass, gunpowder, and printing, the three inventions often credited with transforming medieval into modern Europe, all either came from the East or were developed using knowledge transferred through crusading era contacts. The magnetic compass, essential for the oceanic navigation that would enable European global expansion, reached Europe from China via Islamic intermediaries. Its adoption by Mediterranean sailors in the 13th century made possible the year-round navigation that supported intensified trade. The Portolan charts that resulted, with their unprecedented accuracy, represented a new way of understanding geographic space that would contribute to the scientific revolution. Gunpowder technology, also originating in China, transformed European warfare in ways that undermined the social order of the High Middle Ages. When cannon could demolish castle walls and arquebusiers could kill mounted knights, the military basis of feudalism collapsed. The new warfare required large infantry armies and expensive artillery trains that only centralized monarchies could afford. The gunpowder revolution thus contributed to the rise of the nation-state and the decline of feudal fragmentation. The printing press, as mentioned earlier, democratized knowledge in revolutionary ways. The ability to produce books quickly and cheaply meant that ideas could spread far beyond the narrow circles of clergy and nobility who had monopolized literacy. When Martin Luther's writings could be distributed throughout Germany in a matter of weeks, the possibility of controlling religious discourse through institutional authority vanished. The Protestant Reformation was, in significant measure, enabled by printing technology. The great age of European exploration, beginning in the late 15th century, represented both a continuation and a transformation of the crusading impulse. Portuguese expeditions down the African coast, Vasco da Gama's voyage to India, and Columbus's Atlantic crossing were motivated by a complex mix of motives: the desire for wealth, the quest for Christian allies against Islam, missionary zeal, and simple curiosity. The crusading mentality, redirected from the Levant to new frontiers, shaped European engagement with the wider world. Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal, who sponsored early explorations in the 15th century, was explicitly motivated by crusading ideals. He sought to outflank Muslim control of North African and Middle Eastern trade routes, to find the legendary Christian kingdom of Prester John, and to strike at Islam from unexpected directions. The Portuguese conquest of Ceuta in Morocco in 1415 was conceived as a crusade, and subsequent Portuguese expansion in Africa carried this ideological baggage. Columbus himself framed his voyages in crusading terms. He believed his discoveries would provide wealth to finance the reconquest of Jerusalem, completing the unfinished business of the Crusades. His attitude toward the indigenous peoples he encountered, regarding them as potential converts to Christianity and subjects of European rule, reflected the colonial mentality developed during the Crusader kingdoms in the Levant. The conquistadors who followed him into the Americas would bring similarly violent assumptions about the right to conquer non-Christians. The establishment of European colonial empires in the Americas, Asia and Africa represented, in some sense, the ultimate consequence of the crusading movement. The ideological framework that justified conquering Muslim territories in the name of God could be adapted to justify conquering any non-Christian peoples. The requerimiento, a document read to indigenous Americans before Spanish attacks, demanding they submit to church and crown or face violence, was pure crusading logic applied to a new context. Yet the colonial encounter also complicated European self-understanding in ways that ultimately undermined the simple certainties of crusading ideology. The discovery of civilizations in the Americas that had developed entirely without Christian influence raised troubling theological questions. How could salvation be restricted to Christians if entire hemispheres of humanity had never heard the gospel through no fault of their own? Such questions, debated by theologians like Francisco de Vitoria, reflected a more cosmopolitan consciousness that the Crusades had inadvertently helped to create. The economic consequences of European colonialism, built on foundations laid during the crusading era, were staggering. The flow of silver from American mines monetized the European economy on an unprecedented scale, facilitating commercial capitalism and undermining feudal economic relationships. The Atlantic slave trade, perhaps the most horrific consequence of European expansion, was justified using the same logic of religious and racial difference that had been weaponized during the Crusades. The intellectual revolution of the Renaissance, while having many sources, owed debts to the post-crusading transformation of Europe. The recovery of classical learning, facilitated by contacts with the Islamic world and Byzantine refugees, provided tools for questioning medieval assumptions. Humanist scholars like Petrarch and Erasmus emphasized returning to original sources and thinking critically about received traditions, approaches that would be applied not only to ancient texts, but eventually to scripture and church teachings. The revival of interest in Plato, whose works became more widely available in the 15th century, offered alternatives to the Aristotelian framework that had dominated scholastic thought. Platonic emphasis on ideal forms and mystical knowledge appealed to Renaissance thinkers, dissatisfied with the dry logic chopping of late medieval philosophy. The Platonic Academy in Florence, under the patronage of the Medici family, represented an intellectual culture far removed from the militaristic, theologically rigid atmosphere of the crusading era. Renaissance art, which revolutionized European visual culture, reflected both the wealth accumulated through post-crusading commercial expansion and the new intellectual currents. The development of linear perspective, creating the illusion of three-dimensional space on flat surfaces, represented a mathematical approach to representation that drew on the geometry transmitted from Islamic sources. The humanistic focus on individual personality and emotion, evident in portraiture and religious scenes alike, contrasted sharply with the symbolic, impersonal style of earlier medieval art. The patronage system that supported Renaissance art was itself a product of the commercial capitalism that had developed during and after the Crusades. Wealthy merchants and bankers in Italian cities commissioned works that demonstrated their prestige and piety. The Medici, who had risen to power through banking operations that included financial services for the papacy, became the greatest patrons of Renaissance culture. Their wealth, built partly on foundations laid during the crusading era, made possible the artistic achievements we associate with the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, which would ultimately transform human understanding of the natural world and our place in it, also had roots in the post-crusading intellectual transformation. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge preserved and enhanced by Islamic scholars became available to European scientists. Copernicus, whose heliocentric theory revolutionized cosmology, acknowledged his debt to Islamic astronomers whose work he had studied. The very idea that the universe could be understood through mathematical laws owed much to the synthesis of Greek and Islamic thought that had entered Europe after the Crusades. The development of experimental methods and empirical observation, which characterized the scientific revolution, represented a new way of understanding truth that ultimately challenged religious authority. When Galileo's observations through the telescope contradicted church teachings about the heavens, it became clear that religious tradition could not simply override empirical evidence. The conflict between science and religious authority, which would intensify in subsequent centuries, had roots in the skeptical, questioning intellectual culture that emerged in the post-Crusading era. The Protestant Reformation, which split Western Christianity permanently, can be understood as the culmination of trends set in motion during and after the Crusades. The corruption and political entanglement of the papacy, the commercialization of spiritual services through indulgences, the rising literacy and critical thinking enabled by universities and printing, the mystical and devotional movements emphasizing direct access to God, the nationalist sentiments that resented Italian control of church wealth and appointments. All of these factors, contributing to the Reformation, had roots in the Crusading era and its aftermath. Martin Luther's emphasis on Scripture alone, faith alone, and the priesthood of all believers directly challenged the institutional church that had emerged from the crusading centuries. His translation of the Bible into German, made possible by printing technology, democratized access to Scripture in ways that undermined clerical monopoly on interpretation. The speed with which Reformation ideas spread throughout Northern Europe demonstrated that traditional methods of enforcing religious conformity had become obsolete. The religious wars that devastated Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries represented a horrific working out of conflicts initiated during the Crusading era. The idea that religious difference justified violence, the use of military force to impose religious uniformity, the intertwining of political and religious conflicts, all of these had crusading precedents. The 30 Years' War, which killed millions and left Germany devastated, was in some sense the final terrible consequence of the crusading mentality turned inward. Yet from this chaos emerged new concepts of religious tolerance and separation of church and state. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, ending the 30 Years' War, established principles of state sovereignty and religious pluralism that marked a decisive break with the medieval ideal of unified Christendom. The Crusading project, which had sought to unite Europe under papal leadership against external enemies, had ultimately produced a fragmented religious and political landscape, where unity proved impossible and tolerance became necessary. The development of modern political theory in the wake of religious wars also reflected lessons learned from the Crusading era and its aftermath. Thomas Hobbes, writing during the English Civil War, argued for a strong sovereign power to prevent the chaos of religious conflict. His social contract theory, while authoritarian, represented an attempt to base political authority on reason and consent rather than divine right. John Locke's later theories of natural rights, limited government, and religious tolerance provided philosophical foundations for liberal democracy, a political form unimaginable during the Age of Crusades. The economic theories that would evolve into capitalism also emerged from the commercial practices developed during and after the crusading period. The recognition of self-interest as a legitimate motive, the understanding of markets as mechanisms for coordinating economic activity, the development of property rights and contract law, all of these had been refined in the commercial republics of Italy and the trading networks of the post-crusading Mediterranean. Adam Smith's concept of the invisible hand, describing how individual self-interest could produce collective benefit, would have been incomprehensible to the communal, religiously regulated economy of the High Middle Ages. The Enlightenment of the 18th century, with its emphasis on reason, progress, and human rights, represented the fullest flowering of intellectual seeds planted in the post-crusading transformation. Enlightenment thinkers looked back on the Crusades with horror, seeing them as examples of religious fanaticism and irrationality that humanity had fortunately outgrown. Voltaire's mockery of religious violence and Gibbon's acid commentary on the Crusades, in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, reflected an intellectual culture that had rejected the certainties of medieval Christendom, yet Enlightenment optimism about human rationality and progress also carried forward some problematic legacies from the crusading era. The assumption of European superiority, the conviction that Western civilization represented the pinnacle of human achievement, the sense of mission to spread European values to the rest of the world, these attitudes had deep roots in the crusading mentality. The civilizing mission that justified 19th-century imperialism was in many respects a secularized version of the religious mission that had driven the Crusades. The concept of progress itself, so central to modern Western thought, emerged partly from reflection on the trajectory from medieval to modern times. Europeans looking back from the 18th century could see clear advances in knowledge, technology, prosperity, and political organization. The medieval period, particularly the era of Crusades, was dismissed as a dark age of superstition and violence, from which Europe had fortunately emerged. This narrative of progress from darkness to light became foundational to modern Western identity, even as it obscured the complex realities of medieval civilization and the Islamic world's contributions to European development. The 19th century witnessed the apotheosis of European power globally, built on foundations laid centuries earlier. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain, depended on commercial networks, financial instruments, and capitalist practices that had evolved from medieval origins. The steam engine and factory system represented dramatic innovations, but they operated within economic structures whose genealogy traced back through early modern commercial capitalism to the trading, networks and banking practices of the post-crusading Mediterranean world. European colonial empires reached their greatest extent in the 19th century, controlling vast territories in Asia, Africa, and Oceania. The ideological justifications for this domination mixed secular arguments about civilization and progress with religious mission. Christian missionaries accompanied colonial administrators and merchants, seeking to convert heathen peoples in ways that echoed crusading-era assumptions about the superiority of Christianity and the duty to spread it by force if necessary. The Ottoman Empire, which had once terrified Christian Europe, became the sick man of Europe in the 19th century, its territories contested by European powers. The Crimean War, the Congress of Berlin, and various Balkan crises demonstrated that the balance of power had shifted decisively. The encounter that had begun with European crusaders attempting to conquer Muslim lands had, by the 19th century, resulted in European domination of most of the Islamic world. This reversal of fortunes would have profound consequences in the 20th century and beyond. The relationship between Europe and the Islamic world in the 19th century was complex and contradictory. Orientalist scholarship produced increasingly sophisticated understanding of Islamic history and culture, even as it reinforced stereotypes of Eastern backwardness and despotism. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, which brought European military power directly into the heart of the Islamic world, included scholars and scientists who studied and catalogued Egyptian civilization. This combination of military conquest and intellectual appropriation characterized European engagement with the Islamic world throughout the colonial era. Modernization programs in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt, attempting to adopt European technology and institutions while preserving Islamic identity, produced hybrid societies that fit comfortably into neither traditional nor Western categories. The tension between modernization and cultural authenticity that emerged in the 19th century would intensify in the 20th, contributing to the rise of both secular nationalism and Islamic fundamentalism in the post-colonial Middle East. The Great War of 1914-1918 shattered European confidence in progress and civilization. The industrial slaughter of millions in the trenches revealed that technological advancement did not necessarily correlate with moral improvement. The optimistic 19th century belief in inevitable progress toward peace and prosperity died in the mud of Flanders and Verdun. European civilization, which had defined itself against barbarism, had produced barbarism on an unprecedented scale. The war's aftermath reshaped the Middle East in ways that still reverberate. The Sykes-Picot Agreement and subsequent mandate system carved up the defeated Ottoman Empire, according to European interests, creating artificial states whose borders ignored ethnic, sectarian, and tribal realities. The promise of Arab independence, used to encourage revolt against Ottoman rule, was betrayed by European colonial ambitions. The Balfour Declaration, promising British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, set in motion conflicts that continue into the 21st century. The connection to the Crusades was not lost on contemporaries. General Allenby's entry into Jerusalem in December 1917, ending Ottoman control, was described by some as completing what the Crusaders had failed to achieve. This rhetoric, while perhaps satisfying to European audiences, reinforced Middle Eastern perceptions that Western intervention was essentially a continuation of medieval crusading. The memory of the Crusades, which had faded in European consciousness, remained vivid and bitter in the Middle East. The interwar period witnessed the first stirrings of anti-colonial movements that would eventually dismantle European empires. Nationalist movements in India, Egypt, Indonesia, and elsewhere demanded independence, often framing their struggle against European domination in terms that invoked resistance to foreign crusaders. The language of anti-imperialist resistance drew on historical memories of successful opposition to European expansion, including Muslim victories against the Crusaders. The Second World War accelerated the collapse of European colonialism. European powers emerged from the war economically exhausted and morally compromised, their claims to civilizational superiority undermined by the Holocaust and their collaboration with fascism. The rapid decolonization that followed, particularly in Africa and Asia, represented the definitive end of the colonial era that the Crusades had helped to inaugurate. The world system that emerged, with formerly independent nations and international institutions like the United Nations, represented a repudiation of the imperial models that had dominated since the age of exploration. Yet independence did not resolve the legacies of colonialism and the deeper historical patterns set in motion during the crusading era. Post-colonial states struggled with borders drawn by colonial powers, economic systems oriented towards serving European markets, and political institutions imported from the West. The Cold War superimposed new conflicts onto these unstable foundations, as the United States and Soviet Union competed for influence in the decolonizing world. In the Middle East specifically, the creation of Israel in 1948 and the subsequent Arab-Israeli conflicts became focal points for historical grievances dating back centuries. Palestinian Arabs displaced by Israeli independence invoked the memory of Crusader kingdoms as precedents for ultimately temporary European incursions into the Middle East. Israeli supporters emphasized Jewish historical connections to the land predating both the Crusades and Islamic conquest. The conflict became layered with historical analogies and grievances that made resolution nearly impossible. The Six-Day War of 1967, in which Israel captured Jerusalem's Old City, including the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa Mosque, carried heavy symbolic freight. For many in the Islamic world, it represented another humiliating defeat by Western-backed forces. The occupation of Palestinian territories that continues decades later has been described by critics using crusading analogies, while defenders invoke the need for security against those who would destroy the Jewish state. The past remains intensely present in these debates, shaping perceptions and limiting options for peace. The oil crisis of 1973 demonstrated that the balance of power between the West and the Middle East was not permanently fixed. When Arab oil-producing states used the oil weapon to punish Western support for Israel, they revealed European and American vulnerability. The wealth that flowed into oil-producing states in subsequent decades would fund both modernization and religious movements seeking to restore Islamic authenticity. The interaction between oil wealth, modernization, and religious identity continues to shape Middle Eastern politics. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 marked a decisive moment in the reassertion of Islamic identity against Western influence. The overthrow of the Shah, a Western-backed modernizing monarch, and the establishment of an Islamic republic under Ayatollah Khomeini represented a rejection of both secular nationalism and Western models. Khomeini's rhetoric explicitly invoked historical resistance to crusaders and colonial powers, framing the revolution as part of a long struggle against Western domination. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the subsequent jihad against Soviet occupation created networks of Islamic militants who would later turn their attention to the United States and its allies. The Afghan Mujahideen, funded and armed by the United States as part of Cold War competition, developed an ideology that combined traditional Islamic concepts of jihad with modern revolutionary tactics. The parallels to the medieval Crusades, foreign powers fighting in Muslim lands, religious warfare, massacres of civilians, were obvious to participants and would shape the conflicts that followed. The end of the Cold War in 1991 did not produce the end of history that some optimistic Western commentators predicted. Instead, it revealed or unleashed conflicts that had been suppressed or redirected during the bipolar superpower competition. The Gulf War of 1991, in which a US-led coalition expelled Iraq from Kuwait, brought massive Western military forces into the Arabian Peninsula, home to Islam's holiest sites. Osama bin Laden and others interpreted this presence as a new crusade, a desecration requiring violent resistance. The attacks of September 11, 2001, and the subsequent War on Terror brought the language of crusading explicitly back into contemporary discourse. President George W. Bush's initial description of the response as a crusade was quickly retracted, but the damage was done. Bin Laden and other jihadist leaders had already framed their struggle in terms of resisting a new crusade by Christian and Jewish forces against Islam. The American invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, whatever their stated purposes, were interpreted by many Muslims as confirming this narrative. The imagery and rhetoric on both sides of the War on Terror drew heavily on crusading precedents. Jihadist propaganda invoked Saladin and the victories of medieval Islam against the Crusaders. Western commentary often portrayed the conflict in civilizational terms as a struggle between modernity and medievalism, democracy and theocracy, freedom and oppression, binaries that echoed earlier Orientalist and crusading stereotypes. The past shaped present perceptions in ways that made nuanced understanding difficult. The Iraq War, begun in 2003 with promises of quick victory and democratic transformation, instead produced chaos, sectarian conflict, and ultimately the emergence of ISIS. The Islamic State explicitly modeled itself on early Islamic conquests and positioned itself as resisting a new crusade. Their propaganda videos featured beheadings of Western hostages and the destruction of Crusader-era castles, emphasizing historical continuity. The group's territorial caliphate, though ultimately defeated militarily, demonstrated the continuing power of religious ideology to mobilize violence. The Syrian civil war, which began in 2011 as part of the Arab Spring uprisings, devolved into a complex conflict involving regional powers, international interventions, and sectarian militias. The destruction of ancient cities like Aleppo, the displacement of millions, and the death toll in the hundreds of thousands recalled medieval warfare in its brutality. Russian, American, Turkish, and Iranian forces operating in Syria created a situation where great powers competed for influence in the Levant, a pattern familiar from the crusading era. The rise of populist nationalism in Europe and America in the second decade of the 21st century revealed continuing anxieties about identity, migration, and cultural change that have roots in the medieval past. Concerns about Muslim immigration to Europe, debates about whether Islam is compatible with Western values, and fears of terrorism all echo medieval anxieties about the religious other. The memory of the Crusades, whether accurate or distorted, continues to shape these contemporary debates. Ironically, while some Western nationalists invoke the Crusades as examples of defending Christian Europe against Islam, historical scholarship has thoroughly debunked simplistic narratives of medieval religious conflict. The actual Crusades involved complex political, economic, and social factors beyond religious difference. Crusaders fought against Christian Byzantines and fellow Catholic Europeans. Muslims and Christians in the Levant often cooperated across religious lines based on pragmatic interests. The medieval world was far more complex and hybrid than modern nationalist mythologies acknowledge. Yet historical complexity has little power against the emotional appeal of simple narratives. The image of the Crusades as a clash of civilizations persists in popular consciousness, invoked by those seeking to mobilize religious or national identity against perceived threats. The fact that serious historians reject this interpretation matters less than the cultural work the crusading myth performs in contemporary politics. The past, as always, serves the needs of the present. The ecological consequences of the long historical processes initiated during the crusading era have only recently become apparent. The colonial exploitation of resources, the fossil fuel economy that powered industrial civilization, the global capitalism that destroys traditional ways of life and ecosystems alike. All of these have roots in the commercial expansion and ideological frameworks developed during and after the Crusades. Climate change, the defining challenge of the 21st century, is in some sense the ultimate consequence of the trajectory that began when European civilization turned outward in aggressive expansion. This observation is not meant to blame the Crusades for climate change in any direct causal sense. That would be absurd. Rather, it suggests that the long-term transformations set in motion during the crusading era, including commercial capitalism, colonial exploitation, technological development, and the ideology of progress through domination of nature, created the conditions for our current ecological crisis. The world that rose after the Crusades was one increasingly oriented toward expansion, exploitation, and the transformation of nature to serve human purposes, attitudes now recognized as unsustainable. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020 revealed both the interconnectedness of the modern world and the fragility of the systems that govern it. The global spread of the virus, facilitated by air travel and international commerce, demonstrated that humanity faces common challenges that cannot be addressed through nationalist competition. Yet the pandemic response also revealed deep divisions in values, governance systems, and capacities that echo historical patterns. The vaccine nationalism that privileged wealthy nations over poor ones reflected colonial-era hierarchies. In another way, the pandemic recalled the Black Death that had followed the crusading era. Both plagues exposed the limitations of existing knowledge and institutions. Both prompted religious and philosophical questioning about divine purpose and human meaning. Both accelerated existing social and economic transformations. Whether the COVID-19 pandemic will ultimately contribute to transformations as profound as those that followed the Black Death remains to be seen. But the parallels are suggestive. The current state of Christianity, fragmented into thousands of denominations and sects, competing with secular ideologies and other religious traditions, is unimaginable without the fractures that began in the post-crusading era. The unified Christendom that launched the First Crusade is gone forever, replaced by religious pluralism within and beyond the West. The papacy, while still influential, commands nothing like the authority it claimed during the crusading centuries. The Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, secularization, and globalization have all contributed to a religious landscape that medieval Christians would find incomprehensible. Islam, too, has been transformed by its encounters with the West, including the original Crusades and subsequent colonial domination. The defensive modernization, the struggles between tradition and modernity, the rise of both secular nationalism and religious fundamentalism, all of these reflect the challenges posed by Western power and the need to respond to it. Contemporary debates within Islam about governance, women's rights, violence, and the relationship between religion and state are partly products of this long historical encounter. The relationship between Christianity and Islam, initiated in conflict when Muslim armies erupted from Arabia in the 7th century and intensified during the Crusades, remains one of the defining dynamics of global politics. Despite centuries of mutual influence, learning, and occasional cooperation, the relationship remains troubled by historical grievances and contemporary conflicts. Whether the future will bring reconciliation, continued tension, or renewed violence depends partly on how both traditions reckon with their shared history. The liberal international order established after World War II, despite its many flaws and hypocrisies, represented an attempt to move beyond the imperial and religious conflicts that had characterized earlier eras. The United Nations, the European Union, international human rights law, and global economic institutions sought to create frameworks for cooperation transcending national and religious divisions. These institutions reflect lessons learned from centuries of religious warfare, imperial competition, and the catastrophic world wars of the 20th century. Yet this order is now under strain from multiple directions. Rising authoritarian powers challenge liberal values and seek to establish spheres of influence. Religious and nationalist movements reject cosmopolitan visions in favor of particularist identities. Economic inequality and the failures of globalization have produced populist backlashes against international institutions. The question of whether humanity can cooperate to address common challenges or will retreat into competing blocks recalls earlier patterns of fragmentation that produced centuries of conflict. The technological revolution of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, computers, internet, artificial intelligence, represents a transformation as profound as the printing press or the Industrial Revolution. Like those earlier innovations, whose roots lay partly in knowledge transfer during and after the crusading era, contemporary technology is both liberating and dangerous. It connects humanity as never before while enabling surveillance and manipulation. It democratizes knowledge while spreading misinformation. It empowers individuals while concentrating power in corporate and state hands. The question of how humanity will govern these technologies and whether they will serve human flourishing or exacerbate existing inequalities and conflicts remains open. The patterns visible in earlier technological transformations offer both hope and warning. Technologies developed in one context are adopted for purposes their inventors never imagined. Tools that promise liberation can become instruments of oppression. Knowledge that seems purely beneficial can enable destruction. The gunpowder that made medieval castles obsolete also made industrial warfare possible. Looking back across the centuries from the fall of Acre to the present day, certain patterns become visible. The world that rose after the Crusades was shaped by forces that the Crusaders themselves set in motion, but could not control or predict. Their holy war produced secular capitalism. Their attempt to unite Christendom contributed to its fragmentation. Their confidence in divine favor gave way to skepticism about religious authority. Their territorial conquests proved temporary, but their economic and intellectual consequences proved permanent. The transformations were not unidirectional or inevitable. At each stage, human choices shaped outcomes in ways that might have been different. Alternative paths not taken suggest different worlds that might have been. Yet certain dynamics, once initiated, created conditions that constrained subsequent choices. The commercialization of European economy, once begun, was difficult to reverse. The transfer of knowledge from the Islamic world, once accomplished, could not be forgotten. The fragmentation of religious and political authority, once underway, accelerated despite efforts to restore unity. Perhaps the most important lesson from this long history is the unpredictability of consequences. The Crusaders sought to serve God and win salvation through holy war. They could not have imagined that their efforts would ultimately contribute to the questioning of religious authority itself. The popes who launched crusades to enhance papal power could not have foreseen that these efforts would eventually undermine it. The merchants who financed crusades expecting profit could not have known they were building foundations for a global capitalist system. This should inspire humility about our own moment in history. The challenges we face, climate change, technological disruption, political fragmentation, pandemics, inequality, will have consequences we cannot fully predict. Our responses, however well-intentioned, will produce unintended effects that future generations will have to navigate. The world that will rise from our current crises will likely be as different from our own as our world is from that of the Crusaders. Yet the history also offers some grounds for hope. Medieval society, despite the catastrophes of plague, famine and war, despite the religious conflicts and political fragmentation, despite the corruption of institutions and the failure of grand projects, nonetheless, produced the foundations for transformations that eventually brought, along with much suffering, genuine improvements in human life. The scientific method, democratic governance, human rights, technological progress, all of these emerged from the chaos of the post-crusading centuries. The improvements came not through the implementation of grand designs or the triumph of particular ideologies, but through countless small innovations, experiments and adaptations by people responding to their immediate circumstances. The merchants who developed new financial instruments were not trying to invent capitalism. They were solving practical problems of moving money across distances. The scholars who questioned received wisdom were not trying to spark the Enlightenment. They were following their curiosity and applying reason to difficult questions. This suggests that progress, to the extent it occurs, comes less from utopian projects to remake society, according to rational plans than from the accumulated effects of many people making incremental improvements and adjustments. The Crusades themselves were a kind of utopian project, an attempt to unite Christendom, defeat Islam, and reclaim sacred territory through coordinated violence blessed by God. Their failure demonstrates the limits of such grand schemes. The transformations that actually occurred emerged organically, from the unintended consequences of crusading rather than from its intended goals. The medieval world believed it lived in the final age before Christ's return, that history was moving toward a predetermined end. The Crusades fit into this apocalyptic worldview as part of the cosmic struggle between good and evil. When the Crusaders failed and Christ did not return, this worldview became increasingly difficult to maintain. The recognition that history was not moving toward a predetermined end, that the future was open and unknowable, was both terrifying and liberating. Modern society, despite its secular character, often succumbs to similar teleological thinking, the belief that history moves inevitably toward some end, whether progress and democracy or decline and catastrophe. The history of the post-crusading transformation suggests instead that the future is genuinely open, shaped by the complex interaction of human choices, material conditions, and contingent events. Neither utopian optimism nor apocalyptic pessimism captures the reality of historical change. The fracturing of medieval Christendom into the modern pluralistic world was painful and often violent, but it also created space for diversity, innovation, and freedom that the unified world of the High Middle Ages could not accommodate. The questioning of authority that followed the failure of the Crusades, though it produced conflict and uncertainty, also enabled intellectual and political developments that have enriched human life. The encounter with the Islamic world, though marked by violence, also facilitated the transfer of knowledge that advanced European civilization. This is not to celebrate the Crusades or their consequences uncritically. The violence, suffering, and destruction they caused were real and should not be minimized. The religious hatred they intensified continues to poison relations between Christianity and Islam. The colonial mentality they helped to develop justified centuries of exploitation and oppression. The triumphalist narratives they generated still distort understanding of history and current events. Yet even this negative legacy has ultimately provoked productive responses. The recognition of the horrors of religious warfare contributed to the development of secularism and religious tolerance. The crimes of colonialism prompted anti-imperial movements and the assertion of universal human rights. The distortions of crusading mythology have been challenged by more accurate historical scholarship. The conversation between civilizations, however difficult and incomplete, continues. The world that rose after the Crusades was not the world the Crusaders intended to create, but it was shaped inescapably by their actions and the reactions to them. We inhabit that world still, heir to both its achievements and its pathologies. The commercial capitalism that connects humanity globally emerged from medieval trade networks, expanded during the crusading era. The scientific worldview that enables technological marvels and existential threats was made possible by knowledge transferred from the Islamic world. The political pluralism and religious diversity of modern life emerged from the fracturing of medieval Christendom. We face our own civilizational challenges in the 21st century. Climate change requiring global cooperation, technological change reshaping work and society, migration and diversity challenging national identities, pandemics and ecological crises revealing our interdependence. We might learn something from the long transformation that followed the Crusades. Grand projects to impose unity through force or ideology tend to fail and produce unintended consequences. Encounters with different civilizations, however conflictual, can be sources of learning and growth. The fracturing of old certainties, though painful, can create space for new possibilities. The Crusaders marched east, singing hymns and expecting God's favor. They returned, when they returned at all, with spices and silk, mathematics and philosophy, trauma and disease, wealth and debt. Their descendants inherited a world more complex, more connected, more diverse, and more uncertain than anything their ancestors had known. They had to navigate this complexity without the simple certainties of unified Christendom. In doing so, they created the foundations of the modern world. With all its contradictions and possibilities, we are their heirs, still navigating the consequences of transformations initiated centuries ago. The questions they confronted: how to live with religious and cultural diversity, how to balance tradition and innovation, how to organize society when old authorities have lost credibility, how to make sense of suffering and failure, remain our questions. The answers they found, through centuries of conflict and creativity, both inspire and warn us. The world that rose after the Crusades was built from the ruins of failed dreams and shattered certainties. It was constructed by people who had to adapt to realities they had not chosen and could not control. It was shaped by the interplay of grand ambitions and practical necessities, of ideological conflicts and material interests, of intended actions and unintended consequences. It was, in short, a thoroughly human creation, flawed and magnificent, terrible and wonderful, like all human civilizations, as we look toward an uncertain future, facing challenges that may prove as transformative as those that followed the Crusades. We might take some comfort from this history. The world our descendants inherit will not be the world we intend to create. It will be shaped by our actions but not determined by them. It will emerge from the complex interaction of countless choices, events and forces we cannot fully control or predict. If we are fortunate and wise, if we learn from past mistakes and build on past achievements, if we face reality with courage and imagination, that future world might be better than our present one. But it will certainly be different in ways we cannot imagine. The long shadow of the Crusades has finally begun to fade, 8 centuries after their end. The religious warfare they exemplified no longer dominates global politics, though it has not disappeared. The dream of unified Christendom they represented has been definitively abandoned, replaced by secular states and religious pluralism. The colonial enterprises they prefigured have mostly been dismantled, though their legacies persist. The simple certainties they embodied, that God favored one side, that religious difference justified violence, that might made right, have been questioned if not entirely rejected. Yet in other ways the crusading mentality persists, the conviction that one's own civilization possesses unique virtue and superior values, the willingness to use violence to spread those values, the framing of conflicts in apocalyptic terms, the demonization of others. These attitudes appear across the political spectrum and among adherents of different ideologies and religions. The Crusades ended long ago, but the crusading spirit remains a temptation for humanity whenever we encounter difference and feel threatened by it. Perhaps the ultimate lesson from the world that rose after the Crusades is this: we are all implicated in systems and processes larger than ourselves, inheriting legacies we did not choose and creating consequences we cannot fully control. The Crusaders thought they were serving God's will and winning salvation. They were actually participating in transformations that would undermine the religious certainty they fought to defend. We think we are addressing our immediate challenges and pursuing our immediate goals. We are actually creating a world our descendants will inherit and have to make sense of. This should inspire both humility and responsibility. Humility because we cannot know the full consequences of our actions or control how they will unfold over time. Responsibility because our choices matter, even if they matter in ways we cannot predict. The world will change whether we intend it or not. We can choose to face that change with wisdom and compassion, learning from history's hard lessons, or we can repeat the mistakes of the past, pursuing our certainties and demonizing our enemies until events prove us wrong. The world that rose after the Crusades emerged from the ruins of certainty into the complexities of modernity. We inherit that world, with all its achievements and pathologies, its possibilities and dangers. What world will rise from our own struggles and transformations remains to be written. The Crusaders could not have imagined our world. Our descendants will likely find their world equally unimaginable. The story continues as it always has, written by people trying to navigate circumstances they only partially understand, making choices whose consequences only time will reveal. The Crusades ended in failure, but from that failure emerged a world richer, more complex, and more dynamic than the one that had launched them. This is not to justify the violence or celebrate the suffering they caused, but to recognize that human history moves in unexpected directions. that catastrophes can contain seeds of renewal, and that the consequences of our actions extend far beyond our intentions or understanding. The world that rose after the Crusades was not the world anyone planned or predicted. It was the world that had to be, given what came before. The world rising now and the worlds to come will be no different, shaped by the past, created in the present and open to futures we cannot yet imagine.